The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Amarillo, Texas, casting long shadows between the weathered storefronts and hitching posts. The year was 1884, and the frontier town carried the perpetual scent of horse sweat, leather, and the promise of trouble that seemed to drift in with every tumbleweed. Outside Murphy's saloon, a grizzled man of 67 years knelt beside a chestnut mare, his weathered hands running gently along her foreleg with the practiced touch of someone who had spent more years with horses than most men spent breathing. Jake Morrison looked every inch the broken-down cowpoke that passing strangers took him for. His clothes were simple working gear, faded denim and cotton that had seen better decades. A battered hat sat low over gray eyes that most folks mistook for tired rather than watchful. His face bore the deep lines of a man who had squinted into too many sunrises, and his silver beard needed trimming. When he moved, there was a slight stoop to his shoulders that suggested age had settled into his bones like winter cold. The casual observer would see nothing more than another old-timer counting down his final years in the company of his horse. The mare nickered softly as Jake checked her hooves, his voice a quiet rumble as he spoke to her. "Easy now, Rosita. Just making sure that stone didn't bruise you none." The horse responded to his touch with the trust that came from years of partnership, her ears forward and relaxed despite the chaos of the busy street around them. From the batwing doors of Murphy's saloon came the sound of raucous laughter and the clink of whiskey glasses. The establishment drew the kind of men who lived hard and expected to die young, the sort who measured their worth in how much fear they could inspire in others. It was exactly the type of place where trouble found men like Jake Morrison, even when he wanted nothing more than to water his horse and move on. The trouble arrived in the form of 6 riders who pulled up to the saloon with the swagger of men accustomed to taking whatever they pleased. Their leader was a man called Diamond Pete Carlson, though the nickname came not from any wealth he had earned, but from his habit of prying precious stones from the dead fingers of his victims. Pete stood well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of broad shoulders and thick arms that came from years of hard living and harder fighting. His black hat was adorned with a silver band that caught the light, and his vest was cut from expensive cloth that seemed out of place on a man whose hands bore the calluses of violence rather than honest work. Pete's eyes, small and mean like chips of flint, swept the street with the calculating gaze of a predator seeking easy prey. Those eyes settled on Jake Morrison kneeling beside his horse, and Pete's lips curled into the kind of smile that never reached past his teeth. The old man looked like the perfect mark, the sort of easy target that would make for good sport before they moved on to more serious business. The 5 men who rode with Pete were cut from similar cloth, each one bearing the hard look of someone who had crossed too many lines to ever find their way back to decent society. They dismounted with deliberate noise, boots hitting the dusty ground with thuds meant to announce their presence to anyone within earshot. Their spurs jingled with each step, a sound that might as well have been a rattlesnake's warning for all the menace it carried. But before we see what happens next, if you're enjoying this tale of old-fashioned justice, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling me what state or country you're in. I always get excited seeing how these stories of American frontier courage travel around the world. Now, let's see what Diamond Pete has in store for our quiet cowboy. Jake remained focused on his horse, seemingly oblivious to the approaching danger. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, the kind that might hold tobacco or perhaps a few coins for necessities. The pouch made a soft chinking sound as he moved, the unmistakable music of gold pieces shifting against one another. It was not a large fortune by any measure, but in a town like Amarillo, it represented more money than most men saw in a month of hard labor. Pete's predatory grin widened as he heard that telltale sound. He jerked his head toward his men, a silent signal that required no explanation. The 6 outlaws spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off any escape route Jake might have considered. Their hands rested casually near their gun handles, not quite drawing, but making their intentions clear to anyone who might be watching. "You there, old-timer," Pete called out, his voice carrying the false joviality of a man who enjoyed playing with his food before devouring it. "That's a fine-looking horse you got there. Must have cost you a pretty penny." Jake looked up slowly, his gray eyes meeting Pete's gaze without a hint of the fear the outlaw expected to see. "Thank you kindly," Jake replied, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the afternoon air. She's been good to me these many years. Pete stepped closer, his boots crunching on the scattered straw and dirt. The man's presence seemed to fill the space around them, his shadow falling across Jake's weathered face. I imagine a man with such a fine horse might have other fine things as well. That pouch there, for instance, sounds mighty heavy for an old cowpoke just passing through. Jake's hand moved protectively to the leather pouch, his fingers closing around it with the instinctive gesture of a man guarding something precious. This here belongs to my late wife. It's all I got left of her, save for old Rosita here. The mention of a dead wife seemed to amuse Pete rather than soften him. His laugh was harsh and grating, like the sound of rusty metal scraping against stone. Well, ain't that touching, boys? The old man's got himself some sentimental trinkets. Pete's hand shot out faster than a striking snake, his thick fingers wrapping around Jake's wrist with bruising force. But I'm thinking your late wife don't have much use for gold where she's gone, and I got plenty of use for it right here. Jake's voice remained steady, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that might have been mistaken for defiance rather than the coiling of a deadly spring. I'd be obliged if you'd let go of my wrist, mister. This gold stays with me. Pete's grip tightened, his knuckles going white with the pressure he applied. Or what, Grandpa? You gonna gum me to death? His men erupted in laughter at their leader's wit, the sound echoing off the storefronts like the baying of hungry wolves. With his free hand, Pete reached for the leather pouch, but Jake twisted away from his grasp with a speed that belied his apparent frailty. The movement caught Pete off guard, and for a moment his confident expression faltered. But before Jake could fully escape, Pete's other hand lashed out and seized Rosita's bridle, yanking the mare's head roughly to the side. The horse whinnied in distress, her eyes rolling white with fear and confusion. The sound cut through Jake Morrison like a blade, and anyone watching closely might have noticed the way his entire demeanor changed in that instant. His gray eyes went flat and cold, like chips of winter ice, and the stoop seemed to drain from his shoulders as if years had suddenly fallen away from him. Easy now, Pete said, his voice taking on a harder edge as he maintained his grip on both the horse's bridle and Jake's wrist. This don't have to get ugly, old man. Just hand over that pouch, and we'll be on our way. Nobody gets hurt, and you get to keep breathing. Jake's voice, when he spoke, carried a quality that hadn't been there before, a deadly quiet that seemed to make the very air around them grow still. Mister, I'm going to give you one chance to let go of my horse and walk away from here. One chance. Pete's response was to yank harder on the bridle, causing Rosita to rear slightly in distress. The outlaw's face split into a cruel grin as he watched Jake's expression tighten with barely controlled fury. One chance. And what happens if I don't take your generous offer, Grandpa? Jake Morrison looked up at Diamond Pete Carlson with eyes that had seen things no decent man should ever have to witness, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 47 graves behind it. Then you'll learn why they used to call me the Phantom of San Antonio. But Pete was too drunk on his own power to hear the warning buried in those quiet words. With a harsh laugh, he wrenched the leather pouch from Jake's grasp and shoved the old man backward into the dust. Jake hit the ground hard, his hat falling from his head to reveal silver hair that caught the dying sunlight like spun metal. Much obliged for the donation, old-timer, Pete said, hefting the pouch and listening to the sweet sound of gold coins shifting inside. Consider it payment for the entertainment you provided. The outlaw leader swung up onto his horse, his men following suit with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to making quick escapes. As the 6 riders wheeled their mounts around, Pete couldn't resist one final act of cruelty. He spurred his horse close to where Rosita stood trembling, and brought his quirt down hard across the mare's flank. The horse screamed and bolted, dragging her reins as she fled in blind panic down the dusty street. Pete's laughter followed the fleeing horse like an echo of thunder, and then he and his men were gone, leaving only a cloud of dust and the taste of injustice hanging heavy in the afternoon air. Jake Morrison sat in the dirt where he had fallen, his weathered hands pressed flat against the ground as he watched his beloved horse disappear around the corner. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still, and anyone watching might have thought the encounter had broken something vital inside the old cowboy. They would have been wrong. The interior of Murphy's saloon pulsed with the kind of revelry that came from men celebrating easy money and easier victims. Kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, their yellow light mixing with the blue-gray haze of cigarette smoke that hung in the air like morning fog over a battlefield. The smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and stale tobacco created an atmosphere thick enough to choke a decent man, but the 6 outlaws seated around the corner table breathed it in like perfume. Diamond Pete Carlson held court like a king among thieves, Jake Morrison's leather pouch displayed prominently on the scarred wooden table before him. The gold coins caught the lamplight as Pete poured them from palm to palm, each clink a musical note in his symphony of greed. The sound drew envious glances from other patrons, men who lived hard lives scratching out meager existences from unforgiving land and unforgiving times. "Boys," Pete declared, his voice carrying across the saloon with the confidence of a man drunk on his own power. "I do believe that was the easiest $20 I ever made. Did you see the look on that old buzzard's face when I took his precious treasure?" The outlaw leader's laughter was harsh and grating, like the sound of grinding millstones. His men joined in with the dutiful enthusiasm of followers who knew their place in the pecking order. The youngest of them, a lean scarecrow of a man called Twitchy on account of his nervous habits, slapped his knee with exaggerated amusement. "Boss, you should have seen him sitting there in the dirt like a whipped dog. I thought he might start crying like a baby." Behind the bar, Tommy Sullivan worked with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that survival in a place like Murphy's saloon depended on keeping his ears open and his mouth shut. At 43, Tommy had tended bar in more frontier towns than he cared to count, and he possessed the kind of memory for faces and names that came from years of watching dangerous men drink themselves toward violence. Something about the old cowboy Pete and his crew had nagged at Tommy's mind like a splinter under the skin. There had been something familiar in the man's bearing, in the way he carried himself despite his apparent frailty. The set of his shoulders, the way his eyes had swept the street before settling on his horse, the calm manner in which he had spoken even while being threatened. Tommy had seen that kind of controlled stillness before, in men whose reputations were written in blood and carved on tombstones. Pete's voice cut through Tommy's thoughts like a dull blade through leather. "Barkeep, bring us another bottle of your finest rockgut. We're celebrating what you might call a business transaction." The outlaw's grin revealed teeth stained yellow by tobacco and neglect, and his small eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. Tommy retrieved a bottle of whiskey from beneath the bar, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As he approached the outlaw's table, Pete made a show of counting out coins from Jake's pouch, laying them on the table with exaggerated care. "See that, boys? Real gold, not some painted lead slugs or worthless script. That decrepit old fool had himself a genuine nest egg." The bartender set the bottle on the table and stepped back, but Pete's voice stopped him before he could retreat to the safety of his bar. "You been in this territory long, barkeep? Maybe you knew our generous benefactor from before today?" Tommy's face remained carefully neutral, the expression of a man who had learned that curiosity could be a fatal flaw in his line of work. "Can't say as I did, mister. Lots of folks pass through Amarillo. They tend to blur together after a while." Pete's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Tommy's face for any sign of deception. "Well, if you do happen to remember anything interesting about our friend, you be sure to let us know. Might be worth something to hear stories about where he got his gold." The saloon's batwing doors creaked open, admitting a figure that seemed to bring the evening shadows with him. Jake Morrison stepped into the smoky interior with the unhurried gait of a man who had no particular destination in mind. But Tommy noticed immediately that the old cowboy's posture had changed. The stoop was gone from his shoulders, and he moved with a fluid economy of motion that spoke of muscles and reflexes that age had not yet claimed. Conversations throughout the saloon didn't exactly stop, but they grew quieter, the kind of subtle shift that occurred when predators sensed the presence of something that might not be prey after all. Jake's gray eyes swept the interior of the establishment, taking in the layout, the exits, the number and position of potential threats with the automatic assessment of a professional. Pete looked up from his celebration and burst into fresh laughter at the sight of his victim. "Well, I'll be damned. Look what the cat dragged in, boys. If it ain't our old friend, come crawling back for more punishment." Jake approached the table with measured steps, his boots making soft sounds against the sawdust-covered floor. The conversations around him faded to whispers, then to nothing at all, as other patrons began to sense the electricity building in the air between the two men. When Jake stopped beside Pete's chair, the silence was so complete that the ticking of the old clock above the bar sounded loud as gunshots. "Evening, gentlemen," Jake said, his voice carrying the same quiet courtesy he had shown on the street. "I was wondering if we might discuss returning my property. Perhaps I could buy you all a drink instead, and we could call the matter settled." Pete's response was explosive laughter that seemed to shake dust from the rafters. The other outlaws joined in with varying degrees of genuine amusement and nervous energy, but their leader's mirth had an edge to it that spoke of cruelty rather than humor. "You hear that, boys?" Pete gasped between fits of laughter. "The old coot wants to negotiate. Maybe next he'll offer to arm wrestle me for it, or challenge me to a foot race around the building." Jake remained perfectly still during the outburst, his hands hanging loose at his sides, his expression as calm as a mountain lake on a windless day. The contrast between his stillness and Pete's animated mockery created a tension that seemed to press against the walls of the saloon like steam building in a boiler. "That gold belonged to my late wife," Jake continued, as though Pete had not spoken at all. "It's not much, but it's all I have left of her. I'm asking you politely to return it." Pete's laughter cut off abruptly, his face hardening into the cruel mask that was his true nature. "Your late wife, huh? Well, I got news for you, Grandpa. Dead folks don't need gold where they're going, and you ain't far behind her from the look of things." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and Jake Morrison's gray eyes went flat and cold in a way that made Tommy Sullivan's blood freeze in his veins. The bartender had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who killed as easily as other men drew breath, and he began to back slowly toward the far end of his bar. Pete, oblivious to the change in his victim's demeanor, decided to escalate the humiliation. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, using his considerable height and bulk to loom over the smaller, older man. Then, with the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain, he brought his open hand across Jake's face in a slap that cracked like a whip in the silent saloon. The blow knocked Jake's hat from his head, sending it spinning to land in the sawdust near the wall. Several patrons gasped audibly, and one man near the door quietly slipped outside into the gathering darkness. Pete's men hooted with laughter, but the sound seemed forced now, as though they were trying to convince themselves that what they were witnessing was still amusing. Jake bent slowly and retrieved his hat, brushing the sawdust from its brim with meticulous care. When he straightened, his voice had dropped to little more than a whisper, but every word carried clearly in the electric silence of the saloon. "Mister," Jake said, placing his hat carefully back on his silver hair, "that gold belonged to my late wife Sarah. It was the last gift I ever gave her before the fever took her, and she made me promise to keep it close to remember her by. You can keep the money if that's what you're after, but I'm telling you now, touch my horse again, and you'll join Sarah in whatever comes after this life." The threat was delivered in such a quiet, matter-of-fact tone that it took Pete a moment to process what he had heard. When understanding dawned, his face flushed red with anger and humiliation. The idea that this broken-down old scarecrow would dare threaten him, Diamond Pete Carlson, in front of his men and half the saloon, was an insult that demanded immediate and violent response. Pete gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly at Jake's boots, the glob landing on the worn leather with an audible splat. "Boys, I think our friend here needs to learn some manners about respecting his betters. Why don't you escort him outside and give him a lesson he won't forget?" Two of Pete's men started to rise from their chairs, but they moved with less enthusiasm than they had shown on the street. Something about Jake Morrison's absolute stillness, the way he seemed to be carved from granite rather than flesh and blood, made even hardened criminals think twice about laying hands on him. Jake looked down at the spittle on his boot, then raised his eyes to meet Pete's gaze directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of winter winds and distant thunder. "I gave you fair warning, Pete Carlson. Remember that when the time comes." The use of his full name seemed to surprise Pete, though he couldn't have said why. He had made no secret of his identity, had in fact bragged about his reputation throughout the afternoon, But hearing it spoken in Jake Morrison's flat, emotionless tone sent an unexpected chill down his spine. "Get him out of here," Pete snarled, but his voice lacked the easy confidence it had carried moments before. "And make sure he understands that if I see his face again, I'll put a bullet in it." Jake turned and walked toward the batwing doors with the same measured pace he had used entering the saloon. As he passed the corner table where Oldtimer Ezra Hutchins sat nursing a beer, the grizzled prospector leaned toward his companion and whispered in a voice that carried just far enough for Tommy Sullivan to hear. "Charlie, you see the way that man walks? That's a gunfighter's walk, sure as I'm sitting here. I seen it before, in Dodge City and Tombstone. That old boy ain't what he appears to be." But Jake Morrison was already through the doors and disappearing into the Texas night, leaving behind only questions, tension, and the growing certainty that Diamond Pete Carlson had made the kind of mistake that men rarely lived long enough to regret. Dawn broke over Amarillo like a crimson wound across the eastern sky, painting the dusty streets in shades of amber and gold that did nothing to soften the hard edges of frontier life. The morning brought with it the familiar sounds of a town reluctantly stirring to life, the creak of wagon wheels, the lowing of cattle being driven to market, and the steady rhythm of hammers ringing against anvils in the blacksmith shops that kept the wheels of civilization turning in this harsh corner of Texas. Diamond Pete Carlson and his remaining crew had spent the night in the rooms above Murphy's saloon, their sleep troubled by whiskey and the strange unease that had settled over them after their encounter with the old cowboy. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, they were back on the street, emboldened by daylight and determined to shake off the previous evening's unsettling mood by doing what they did best, making life miserable for anyone too weak to fight back. Their first victim of the day was Martha Henderson, a widow woman who ran a small seamstress shop on the main street. Pete kicked over her carefully arranged display of fabric samples, sending bolts of cloth rolling into the dusty road, while his men laughed and made crude jokes about what they might do with the material. When Martha protested, Pete backhanded her casually, as though swatting a fly, and told her to keep her mouth shut if she knew what was good for her. The second incident involved old Heinrich Mueller, the German immigrant who operated the town's bakery. Pete and his men helped themselves to fresh bread and pastries, stuffing their faces while Heinrich watched helplessly, knowing that any protest would likely result in his shop being burned to the ground. When they had eaten their fill, Pete wiped his greasy hands on Heinrich's apron and informed him that they might be back later for dinner, depending on how generous the town proved to be. It was while Pete was terrorizing the baker that young Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb finally worked up the courage to approach the outlaws. Webb was barely 22 years old, fresh-faced and earnest in the way that only young men who had never truly faced evil could be. His badge gleamed silver on his vest, and his hand rested uncertainly on the grip of his single-action Colt, a weapon he had fired perhaps a dozen times in practice, but never in anger. "Excuse me," Webb called out, his voice cracking slightly with nervous tension. "I'm going to have to ask you gentlemen to move along. There have been complaints about disturbances, and I'm afraid I can't allow you to continue harassing the local merchants." Pete turned slowly, a piece of stolen strudel still hanging from his lips, and regarded the young lawman with the kind of amused contempt normally reserved for particularly stupid children. His men spread out slightly, hands drifting toward their weapons with the lazy confidence of predators who had cornered easy prey. Well, Pete drawled, wiping crumbs from his beard with deliberate slowness. "Look what we got here, boys. A genuine 10-star hero, complete with a shiny badge and everything. Tell me, son, you ever actually killed a man, or is that pistol just for show?" Webb's face flushed red, but to his credit, he stood his ground despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "That's Deputy Sheriff Webb to you, and I'm ordering you to cease this harassment immediately or face the consequences under territorial law." Pete's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Territorial law? In this godforsaken dust bowl? The nearest federal marshal is 3 days' ride from here, boy, and your sheriff is probably passed out drunk in his office like he is every other morning. You want to talk consequences? How about I show you what happens to puppies who try to bark at wolves?" The outlaw leader took a step toward Webb, his hand moving to rest on his gun, but in a gesture that was both casual and unmistakably threatening. The young deputy's nerve finally broke, and he backed away with quick, shuffling steps that drew more laughter from Pete's crew. "Smart boy," Pete called after the retreating lawman. "You run along now and let the grown-ups handle their business. Maybe when you get some real experience, you can come back and try again." Meanwhile, at the other end of town, near the livery stable, Jake Morrison knelt beside his chestnut mare in the pale morning light, his weathered hands moving with gentle precision as he examined every inch of her coat and legs. Rosita had returned during the night, drawn by the familiar scent of her master and the promise of oats and water, but Jake could see the angry red welt across her flank where Pete's quirt had struck her. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, his voice soft with the kind of tenderness he reserved only for animals and the memory of his deceased wife. "Let me see what that bastard did to you." His fingers traced the mark left by the outlaw's whip, and Rosita shivered slightly at his touch, though whether from pain or remembered fear, Jake could not say. The sight of his horse's injury did something to Jake Morrison that all of Pete's insults and threats had failed to accomplish. Where the theft of his gold had angered him, and the slap to his face had sparked his temper, the evidence of cruelty to his beloved mare ignited something deeper and more dangerous. The cold, professional fury of a man who had spent decades making the frontier safe for decent people by removing those who preyed upon the innocent. As Jake tended to his horse, applying a poultice made from herbs he carried in his saddlebags, he became aware of someone watching him from across the street. The observer was a man of perhaps 50 years, lean and sun-darkened, with the ramrod-straight posture of someone who had spent his life in military service. The stranger studied Jake with the kind of intense concentration that suggested recognition struggling to surface from the depths of memory. Samuel Hayes had served as a cavalry sergeant for 15 years before retiring to run a small freight business in Amarillo. He had fought Apaches in Arizona, Comanches in Texas, and renegade whites who were often worse than either. In all those years of violence and hardship, he had encountered men whose reputations were spoken in whispers around campfires, legends who walked among ordinary mortals but stood apart from them like wolves among sheep. Something about the old cowboy's movements, the way he held his shoulders, and the methodical precision with which he cared for his horse, tugged at Hayes' memory like a fish on a line. There was a familiarity in the man's bearing that Hayes could not quite place, but which filled him with a growing sense of unease mixed with anticipation. Hayes crossed the street slowly, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. As he drew closer, he could see the old cowboy's profile more clearly, and suddenly the years seemed to fall away like pages torn from a calendar. The silver hair had once been black as midnight, and the lined face had once been smooth, but the eyes were the same, pale gray orbs that seemed to hold winter storms and the ghosts of dead men. "Sweet Jesus and all the saints," Hayes breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jake Morrison, the Phantom of San Antonio." Jake looked up at the sound of his name, his gray eyes meeting Hayes' gaze with the calm directness of a man who had nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. He studied the ex-soldier's face for a moment, then nodded slightly in recognition. "Sergeant Hayes," Jake said quietly, "it's been a long time since Fort Griffin. You're looking well." Hayes felt his knees go weak as the confirmation of his suspicions hit him like a physical blow. He had heard the stories, of course, whispered around army campfires and in frontier saloons from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. Jake Morrison, the legendary Texas Ranger who had single-handedly cleaned up 3 of the most lawless towns in the territory. Jake Morrison, who had tracked down and killed the entire Blackwood gang after they murdered a family of settlers. Jake Morrison, the man they called the Phantom because he seemed to appear out of nowhere when justice needed to be served, then vanish again like morning mist. But the stories hadn't prepared Hayes for the reality of standing face to face with a living legend, especially one who looked like nothing more than a tired old cowboy tending his horse in the early morning light. "Mr. Morrison," Hayes said, his voice filled with the kind of awe normally reserved for natural disasters or acts of God. "I heard you were dead. There was talk that you got gunned down in El Paso, or maybe it was Laredo. Nobody seemed to know for sure, but the stories stopped coming, and folks figured you'd finally met someone faster." Jake's smile was thin and cold as a blade in winter. "I retired, Sergeant, 15 years ago, after my Sarah died of the fever." Figured I'd done enough killing for one lifetime, and I wanted to see if I could find some peace before I joined her. Hayes glanced around nervously, as though afraid someone might overhear their conversation and spread word of Jake's presence. But the early morning street was largely deserted, with most of the townspeople still in their homes or businesses, avoiding the outlaws who had made Amarillo their temporary playground. 47 men, Hayes said, his voice filled with something that might have been reverence or terror. That's what they said you killed in your time as a ranger. 47 men, all of them armed and dangerous, all of them given fair chance to surrender before you put them in the ground. Jake's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his pale eyes like distant lightning. 47 that we counted official, he corrected quietly. There were others along the way, men who chose to do harm to innocents and paid the price for their choices. I never kept an exact tally, Sergeant. It seemed like bad luck to count them up. The two men stood in silence for a moment, Hayes struggling to reconcile the legend with the reality of the aging cowboy before him, while Jake continued his careful examination of his horse's injury. Finally, Hayes found his voice again, though it came out as little more than a croak. They said you once stopped a Comanche war party single-handed. 20 braves painted for battle, and you talked them into turning around and going home without firing a shot. Jake's hands stilled on Rosita's flank, and for a moment his eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the dusty street of Amarillo. That was different, he said finally. Their war chief was a man called Standing Bear, and he'd lost 2 sons to cavalry raids the month before. He was looking for vengeance, not conquest, and sometimes a man consumed by grief can be reasoned with if you know the right words to use. But Hayes was already lost in the legend, his voice dropping to an awed whisper as he recounted stories that had been told and retold around 1,000 campfires. They said you could draw and fire 6 shots before most men could clear leather. They said you never missed, never hesitated, never showed mercy to those who preyed on the innocent. They said you were death itself, walking the frontier in boots and spurs. Jake straightened slowly, his weathered face showing the first hint of the steel that lay beneath his mild exterior. I was a lawman, Sergeant, nothing more and nothing less. I did what needed doing to protect folks who couldn't protect themselves. The fact that I was good at it doesn't make me some kind of mythical figure. But even as he spoke the words, Jake Morrison felt the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders, the burden of a reputation written in blood and carved on tombstones. He had hoped that 15 years of quiet retirement would let him fade into obscurity, but the past had a way of catching up with a man, especially when that past involved as many dead men as his did. Hayes was backing away now, his face pale with the realization of what he had stumbled upon. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "there are men in town who need to know you're here. Bad men, who've been terrorizing decent folks with no one to stop them. Maybe it's time the Phantom of San Antonio came out of retirement." Jake's gray eyes went flat and cold, and for just a moment Hayes could see the legendary gunfighter that had once walked the frontier like an avenging angel. But then the moment passed, and Jake was just a tired old man again, grieving for his injured horse and the peaceful life that seemed to be slipping away from him like water through cupped hands. "I'm not that man anymore, Sergeant," Jake said quietly. "That man died with my Sarah, and I buried him beside her grave. I'm just a broken-down cowboy now, trying to live out his remaining years in peace." But Hayes was already hurrying away, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. Within minutes, he had found Tommy Sullivan sweeping the front steps of Murphy's saloon, and the words spilled out of him in an excited rush. "Tommy, you ain't going to believe this, but that old cowboy those outlaws robbed yesterday? That's Jake Morrison. The Jake Morrison, the Phantom of San Antonio himself." Tommy's broom fell from nerveless fingers as the pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place in his mind. The controlled movements, the watchful eyes, the way the old cowboy had delivered his warning to Pete Carlson in a voice that carried the weight of absolute certainty. It all made sense now, and Tommy felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what kind of storm was about to break over their quiet town. The word spread through Amarillo like wildfire, passed from mouth to ear in hushed, reverent whispers. Jake Morrison was alive. Jake Morrison was in town. Jake Morrison had been robbed and insulted by Diamond Pete Carlson, and anyone with half a brain knew that such affronts to a man of his reputation could not go unanswered. By noon, even Pete and his crew had heard the rumors, though they dismissed them with the same casual arrogance they brought to everything else. Old man fairy tales, Pete scoffed when one of his men mentioned the whispered stories. Bunch of superstitious fools trying to make their broken-down old cowboy into some kind of legend. Next they'll be telling us he's Buffalo Bill, and Annie Oakley rolled into one. But back at the livery stable, Jake Morrison was no longer the stooped, frail-looking old-timer who had been robbed in the street the day before. His shoulders had straightened, and his movements carried the fluid precision of a professional killer. He worked methodically, checking the loads in his twin Colt Peacemakers, weapons he hadn't touched in 15 years, but which felt as familiar in his hands as his own heartbeat. The guns were works of art as much as instruments of death, their grips worn smooth by years of use, and their barrels blackened by powder burns from dozens of gunfights. Each weapon had been modified by a master gunsmith in San Antonio, with hair triggers and perfectly balanced weights that made them extensions of Jake's will rather than mere tools. As he cleaned and oiled the weapons, Jake Morrison felt the familiar calm descending over him, the cold professional detachment that had once made him the most feared lawman on the frontier. He had tried to leave this part of himself buried with his wife, but Diamond Pete Carlson had made that impossible when he chose to hurt an innocent animal out of pure malice. Some men, Jake reflected as he slid the Colts into the worn leather holsters he hadn't worn in 15 years, simply couldn't be reasoned with or reformed. Some men were like rabid dogs, too dangerous to be allowed to run free among decent folks. And when such men crossed his path, Jake Morrison had never been one to shirk his duty, no matter how heavy the weight of that duty might be on his soul. The Phantom of San Antonio was coming out of retirement, and Diamond Pete Carlson was about to learn why some legends were better left undisturbed. The sun reached its merciless peak as noon settled over Amarillo like a brass weight pressed against the earth. Main Street shimmered with heat waves that rose from the packed dirt like ghostly dancers, and the shadows cast by the wooden storefronts had shrunk to thin black lines that provided no relief from the punishing Texas heat. Most sensible folks had retreated indoors during the brutal midday hours, leaving the street largely empty except for a few horses tied to hitching posts and the ever-present tumbleweeds that rolled past like the bones of dead dreams. Diamond Pete Carlson and his 5 remaining men had claimed the front porch of Murphy's saloon as their throne room, their boots propped up on the railing as they surveyed their temporary kingdom with the lazy confidence of predators who had never faced a real challenge. Empty whiskey bottles cluttered the weathered boards around their chairs, testament to a morning spent celebrating their easy conquest of the previous day. Pete himself sat in the center of the group, Jake Morrison's leather pouch still displayed prominently on the small table beside his chair like a trophy of war. The stolen gold caught the harsh sunlight as Pete poured the coins from palm to palm, each clink a musical reminder of how effortlessly they had humiliated the old cowboy. The sound seemed to amuse Pete endlessly, and he punctuated each pour with crude jokes about broken-down has-beens who didn't know their place in the world. "Boys," Pete declared, his voice slightly slurred from the morning's drinking, "I'm thinking we might make this town our permanent headquarters. Folks here seem mighty accommodating, and there's probably plenty more where this came from." He gestured toward the leather pouch with a grin that revealed his tobacco-stained teeth. His men responded with the dutiful laughter of followers who knew their survival depended on keeping their leader's ego properly fed. Twitchy, the nervous scarecrow who served as Pete's unofficial second-in-command, nodded enthusiastically as he cleaned his fingernails with the point of a wicked-looking knife. "You're right as rain, boss," Twitchy agreed. "This place is ripe for the picking. Hell, that baby-faced deputy ran off like a scalded cat when you just looked at him sideways. Ain't nobody in this dust bowl got the sand to stand up to real men like us." The other members of the gang voiced their agreement with varying degrees of enthusiasm. There was Bull Morrison, no relation to Jake despite sharing a surname, a mountain of a man whose primary qualifications for outlaw life were his enormous fists and his willingness to use them on anyone smaller than himself. Beside him sat Snake Henley, a thin, pale man whose nickname came from his habit of sliding a blade between a victim's ribs before they knew they were in danger. The remaining two were the Kowalski brothers, Polish immigrants who had turned to crime when honest work proved too demanding for their limited skills and unlimited appetites for violence. From their elevated position on the saloon porch, the outlaws commanded an excellent view of the entire main street, which was why Pete noticed the figure emerging from the livery stable at the far end of town while the man was still several hundred yards away. At first, Pete paid little attention to the distant figure, assuming it was just another local cowhand going about his daily business. But as the figure drew closer, something about his bearing began to seem familiar. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete said, rising slowly from his chair and shading his eyes with one hand. "Look what we got here, boys. Our old friend seems to have found himself some backbone after all." The five outlaws turned their attention toward the approaching figure, and even at a distance they could see that something fundamental had changed about the man they had so easily humiliated the day before. Jake Morrison walked down the center of Main Street with the measured pace of a man who had all the time in the world and nowhere else he needed to be. His shoulders were square and level, no longer stooped with apparent age, and his hands hung loose at his sides in a way that suggested relaxed readiness rather than weakness. Most significantly, Jake now wore a gun belt around his waist, the worn leather holsters riding low on his hips in the manner of a man who had spent years perfecting the deadly art of the quick draw. The twin Colts nestled in those holsters seemed to absorb the harsh sunlight rather than reflect it, their dark metal surfaces speaking of use and maintenance by someone who understood that his life might depend on their perfect function. Pete's initial amusement began to curdle into something approaching unease as Jake continued his steady approach. There was something unsettling about the old cowboy's calm determination, the way he seemed to ignore the brutal heat and the empty street around him as though they were merely stage props in a drama that mattered only to him. "What do you suppose he wants, boss?" Twitchy asked, his voice carrying a nervous edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Maybe he's come to apologize for his rudeness yesterday." Pete forced a laugh that sounded harsh and brittle in the still air. "More likely he's come to beg for his gold back. Probably figures if he crawls enough, we might throw him a few coins out of pity." But even as Pete spoke the words, he found himself studying Jake Morrison's approach with growing attention. There was something about the man's walk, the fluid economy of motion that spoke of muscles and reflexes that age had not yet claimed, that reminded Pete uncomfortably of stories his grandfather had told him about gunfighters from the early days of the frontier. Jake stopped approximately 20 paces from the saloon porch, well within easy pistol range, but far enough away to avoid any immediate physical threats. His pale gray eyes swept over the six outlaws with the kind of professional assessment that a butcher might give to a side of beef, cataloging weaknesses and planning his work with methodical precision. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air despite its quiet tone. "I've come to collect my property and discuss your treatment of my horse." Pete's forced laughter rang out across the empty street like breaking glass. "Your property? Old man, everything you had became mine the moment I decided I wanted it. As for that bag of bones you call a horse, she needed a lesson in respect, same as you do." Jake's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle coiling that reminded Pete of a rattlesnake preparing to strike. The comparison was so vivid and unsettling that Pete found himself taking an involuntary step backward toward the saloon's entrance. "Pete Carlson," Jake said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every ear on the porch, "I'm going to give you and your men one chance to return my gold and ride out of this town. One chance to walk away from here with your lives intact." The audacity of the threat, delivered by a single old man to six armed outlaws, was so absurd that Pete's men erupted in laughter that echoed off the storefronts like the baying of hyenas. But Pete himself wasn't laughing anymore. There was something in Jake Morrison's eyes, a cold certainty that spoke of absolute confidence in his ability to back up his words with action, that made the outlaw leader's blood run cold. "One chance," Pete repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "You hear that, boys? The old coot thinks he's some kind of gunfighter from a dime novel. Maybe next he'll tell us he used to ride with Wild Bill Hickok." Jake's response was to shift his weight slightly, settling into the balanced stance of a professional gunman. His hands moved to rest near the grips of his twin Colts, not quite drawing, but making his intentions absolutely clear to anyone with eyes to see. "My name is Jake Morrison," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of 47 graves behind it. 15 years ago, they called me the Phantom of San Antonio. I killed 47 men in the service of law and order, all of them armed and dangerous, all of them given fair chance to surrender before I put them in the ground. I retired when my wife died, hoping to find some peace in my remaining years. But you made that impossible when you chose to hurt an innocent animal out of pure malice." The laughter died on the outlaw's lips as the implications of Jake's words sank in. Even men who lived by violence had heard whispered stories of the Phantom of San Antonio, the legendary lawman who had cleaned up half the frontier with nothing but twin Colts and an iron will. They had always assumed the stories were exaggerated, the kind of tall tales that grew in the telling around campfires and in saloons. Now, faced with the living legend himself, they began to understand that some stories were told not because they were too good to be true, but because they were too terrible to forget. "You're bluffing," Pete said, but his voice lacked the easy confidence it had carried moments before. "Jake Morrison died years ago. Everyone knows that." Jake's smile was thin and cold as a blade in winter. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, but yours won't be." The words hung in the superheated air like smoke from a fired gun, and suddenly the street seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. Pete felt sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the shade of the saloon porch, and his hand moved instinctively toward the grip of his revolver. "Draw," Jake Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "All of you, together. It's the only chance you have." Pete's nerve finally broke under the pressure of Jake's unwavering stare and deadly calm. With a curse that was half fear and half rage, he clawed for his gun, his 5 men following suit with the desperate haste of men who suddenly realized they were fighting for their lives. Jake Morrison's hands moved with the fluid precision of a master craftsman, his twin Colts seeming to appear in his grasp by magic rather than any visible draw. The legendary speed that had made him a frontier legend was still there, refined by years of practice and honed by the certain knowledge that hesitation meant death. The first shot from Jake's right-hand Colt took Twitchy in the center of his chest before the nervous outlaw's gun had cleared its holster. The impact lifted the scarecrow-thin man off his feet and sent him crashing backward through the saloon's front window in an explosion of glass and blood. His own pistol fired once into the porch ceiling as dying nerves contracted, then fell silent forever. Jake's left-hand Colt spoke a heartbeat later, the bullet catching Bull Morrison in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. The massive outlaw's gun went flying from suddenly nerveless fingers to clatter across the porch boards, and Bull dropped to his knees with a bellow of pain and surprise that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The remaining 4 outlaws dove for cover with the panicked haste of men who had suddenly realized they were facing something far beyond their experience or ability to handle. Pete threw himself behind the heavy wooden table that had held his chair, while Snake Henley rolled behind the thick support posts that held up the porch roof. The Kowalski brothers scrambled for the dubious protection of overturned chairs and whatever other debris they could find. Jake advanced steadily up the street, his boots making soft sounds against the packed earth as he closed the distance between himself and his enemies. His gray eyes were flat and emotionless, the eyes of a professional killer who had long ago learned to set aside mercy and sentiment in favor of cold efficiency. A shot rang out from behind the table where Pete had taken cover, the bullet whining past Jake's ear close enough to part his silver hair. Jake's response was immediate and precise, his right-hand Colt barking once to send a slug through the table's wooden top. Pete's scream of pain and terror suggested that the bullet had found flesh, though not fatally. Snake Henley tried to use Jake's focus on Pete to his advantage, leaning out from behind his post to take careful aim at the advancing gunfighter. But Jake had been fighting multiple opponents since before Snake was born, and peripheral vision, honed by decades of life-or-death encounters, warned him of the threat. Without even turning his head, Jake's left-hand Colt swung toward the post and fired twice in rapid succession. The first bullet splintered wood inches from Snake's face, filling his eyes with debris and splinters. The second bullet, fired before the echoes of the first had faded, took Snake through the throat as he jerked backward in surprise. The pale outlaw toppled from the porch to land in the dusty street with a wet, gurgling sound that faded quickly to silence. The elder Kowalski brother, Stefan, tried to make a break for the saloon's front door, hoping to find better cover inside the building. But Jake Morrison had anticipated the move, and his right-hand Colt tracked the running man with mechanical precision. The bullet caught Stefan between the shoulder blades and drove him face first into the saloon's front wall with enough force to leave a dark stain on the weathered wood. That left only Pete Carlson, wounded and trapped behind his inadequate cover, and Victor Kowalski, the younger brother who had frozen behind his overturned chair like a rabbit paralyzed by the sight of a hunting hawk. Jake reloaded both weapons with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed the action thousands of times, his eyes never leaving the positions where his remaining enemies sheltered. "Pete," Jake called out, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "You've got one man left, and he doesn't look like he's got much fight in him. Last chance to surrender and face a judge instead of an undertaker." Pete's response was a wild shot fired blindly over the top of his table, the bullet going wide by several feet to shatter a window in the general store across the street. The shot was followed by Pete's voice, high and wavering with fear and pain. "Go to hell, Morrison," Pete screamed. "I ain't giving up to no washed-up has-been. Victor, get around behind him. We can still take him if we work together." But Victor Kowalski had seen enough death for one day, and the sight of his brother's body sprawled against the saloon wall had drained all the fight from his spirit. Instead of following Pete's desperate order, the younger Kowalski threw his unfired pistol into the street and stood with his hands raised high above his head. "I surrender," Victor called out, his voice breaking like a teenage boy's. "Please don't kill me, Mr. Morrison. I ain't shot nobody today. I don't want to die like this." Jake studied the young outlaw for a moment, taking in the genuine terror in his eyes and the trembling hands raised in surrender. "Smart boy," Jake said quietly. "Walk away from here and don't look back. If I see you again, I'll assume you've chosen to continue your life of crime, and I'll act accordingly." Victor needed no further encouragement. He leaped down from the porch and ran down Main Street, as if all the demons of hell were snapping at his heels, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each panicked stride. Within moments, he had disappeared around a distant corner, leaving behind only the echo of his retreat and the promise that at least one member of Diamond Pete's gang would live to see another sunrise. That left only Pete Carlson himself, wounded and alone behind his bullet-riddled table, surrounded by the bodies of men who had followed him into this one-sided battle. Jake Morrison advanced toward the porch with the measured pace of inevitable death, his twin Colts steady in his hands, and his pale gray eyes fixed on the spot where Pete cowered. "Pete Carlson," Jake said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "it's time we finished our business." The afternoon sun hung like a merciless eye above Main Street, casting everything in harsh light that seemed to bleach the color from the world and leave only shades of dust and blood. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the still air, mixing with the metallic scent of spilled blood and the ever-present odor of horse sweat and leather that defined every frontier town. For bodies lay scattered across the saloon porch like discarded dolls, their life stories written in crimson stains that would mark the weathered wood for years to come. Behind the bullet-riddled table that had served as his inadequate fortress, Diamond Pete Carlson crouched like a wounded animal, his expensive vest now torn and stained with his own blood. The bullet from Jake Morrison's Colt had torn through the wooden tabletop and caught him in the left side, leaving a burning furrow across his ribs that bled freely despite the pressure he applied with his trembling hand. His gun shook so violently in his grip that it seemed doubtful he could hit the broadside of a barn, much less a man who moved with the fluid precision of a master gunfighter. Pete's small, mean eyes darted frantically around the porch, searching for some avenue of escape that his panicked mind might have overlooked. But Jake Morrison had positioned himself with the tactical expertise of a man who had survived dozens of similar confrontations, cutting off every possible retreat while maintaining a clear field of fire. The legendary Phantom of San Antonio stood 20 feet away, his twin Colts steady in his hands, and his pale gray eyes fixed on Pete's hiding place with the unwavering focus of a hunting wolf. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of townspeople fleeing to safety and Pete's ragged breathing as he struggled to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm what remained of his courage. Jake Morrison made no move to advance or retreat, content to let time work in his favor as Pete's wound continued to weaken him and his nerves frayed like old rope under strain. "Just you and me now, Pete," Jake called out, his voice carrying the same deadly calm that had characterized his every word since the shooting began. "Like you wanted when you decided to take what didn't belong to you." Jake holstered his left-hand Colt with a deliberate slowness that was somehow more threatening than any quick draw could have been. The gesture suggested absolute confidence in his ability to handle Pete Carlson with a single weapon, an insult that cut deeper than any bullet could have managed. The remaining Colt stayed in Jake's right hand, held with the casual ease of a man who had spent decades making such weapons extensions of his will. Pete tried to summon some of his old bravado, the swagger that had carried him through years of bullying and terrorizing those weaker than himself. But the words came out cracked and wavering, like the voice of a much older and more frightened man. "This ain't over, Morrison," Pete called out, though his voice carried more desperation than defiance. "You think killing me is going to solve anything? There's a dozen more like me out there, and they'll come looking for revenge when they hear what happened here." Jake's response was to take a single step forward, his boot heel clicking against the wooden steps of the saloon porch with the finality of a coffin nail being driven home. The sound seemed to echo in the oppressive silence, and Pete flinched as though he had been struck. "I've been thinking about you, Pete Carlson," Jake said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly to every corner of the street. "Thinking about all the families you've terrorized, all the innocent folks who've suffered because of your greed and cruelty. The Hendersons down in Laredo, who lost their farm when you burned their barn and killed their livestock. The Murphy family in El Paso, whose daughter still wakes up screaming because of what your men did to her." Each name hit Pete like a physical blow, reminding him of crimes he had tried to forget or justify in the years since their commission. Jake Morrison's voice continued its relentless catalog of Pete's sins, delivered in the flat, emotionless tone of a judge reading a death sentence. "The Wong family, who ran that general store in Tucson. Old man Wong tried to protect his wife when you decided you wanted more than just his money. Remember how she begged you to stop? Remember how you laughed when she cried?" Pete's face went ashen as memories he had buried under layers of whiskey and false bravado came flooding back with crystal clarity. He had convinced himself over the years that his victims were just obstacles to be overcome, faceless impediments to his desires rather than real people with families and dreams and the right to live without fear. "Stop it," Pete gasped, his voice breaking like that of a child confronted with punishment he knew he deserved. "That's all ancient history. I can make this right, Morrison. I can give you your gold back, plus interest. Hell, I'll give you everything I got if you just walk away." Jake's laugh was as cold and sharp as winter wind cutting across a cemetery. "The gold was never the issue, Pete. The gold belonged to my Sarah, and it would have found its way back to me eventually. What I can't forgive, what I won't let slide, is what you did to my horse." The mention of the injured mare seemed to transform Jake Morrison from a man into something far more dangerous and implacable. His gray eyes went flat and dead, reflecting nothing but the absolute certainty that Pete Carlson would not leave Amarillo alive. "You hurt an innocent animal out of pure malice," Jake continued, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "You struck her with a whip because you enjoyed causing pain to something that couldn't fight back. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are, Pete Carlson. And men like you don't deserve to draw another breath in this world." Pete's last shred of courage finally snapped under the pressure of Jake's words and unwavering stare. With a desperate cry that was half sob and half battle yell, he lunged from behind his overturned table and made a wild dash toward the hitching post where his horse waited, still saddled from the morning's ride through town. Jake Morrison made no move to stop Pete's desperate flight, content to watch with the patience of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere to run. Pete's boots pounded against the wooden porch as he vaulted over the railing and landed hard in the dusty street, his wounded side screaming in protest, but adrenaline driving him forward toward what he hoped might be salvation. The outlaw leader's horse, a big bay stallion with the look of an animal that had been pushed hard and fed poorly, shied nervously as Pete approached with blood streaming down his side and panic written across his features. But years of harsh training had made the horse responsive to Pete's commands, and it stood still long enough for the wounded man to haul himself into the saddle with a grunt of pain and effort. Pete wheeled the horse around to face Jake Morrison, who had descended from the saloon porch and now stood in the center of Main Street with the casual stance of a man waiting for a stagecoach rather than preparing for mortal combat. The contrast between Pete's wildy desperation and Jake's supernatural calm was so stark that it might have been comical under different circumstances. "You want to fight, old man?" Pete screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria as he spurred his horse forward. "Then let's finish this the way men are supposed to fight. Man to man, gun to gun, may the best killer win." Pete Carlson charged down Main Street like a medieval knight riding to battle, his pistol blazing as he fired shot after shot at the motionless figure of Jake Morrison. But shooting accurately from the back of a galloping horse required skills that Pete had never bothered to develop, and his bullets flew wide of their target to shatter windows and splinter wooden storefronts in a wild spray of lead and fury. Jake Morrison stood perfectly still as Pete thundered toward him, making no move to dodge or seek cover as death approached at a full gallop. To the terrified townspeople watching from behind doors and windows, it seemed impossible that anyone could survive such an assault. Yet Jake remained rooted in place like a statue carved from living stone. At the last possible moment, when Pete's horse was close enough that Jake could see the foam flecking its muzzle and the wild fear in its rolling eyes, the legendary gunfighter finally moved. But instead of diving aside or returning fire, Jake Morrison simply stepped to one side with the fluid grace of a dancer, moving just far enough to avoid the charging horse while bringing his Colt to bear with mechanical precision. The single shot from Jake's weapon was almost anticlimactic after the thunderous barrage that had preceded it, but its effect was immediate and devastating. The bullet took Pete's horse through the chest, dropping the gallant animal in mid-stride and sending its rider tumbling through the air in a tangle of arms and legs that ended with a bone-jarring impact against the packed earth of Main Street. Pete rolled twice before coming to rest against the watering trough outside the hardware store, his gun flying from nerveless fingers to land several feet away in the dust. For a moment he lay stunned and motionless, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths as he struggled to understand how his desperate gambit had failed so completely. The bay stallion had died instantly, Jake's bullet piercing its heart with the surgical precision that had made him legendary throughout the frontier. Now Pete found himself trapped behind the horse's body, using his own mount's corpse as a shield in a grotesque parody of the honor he had always claimed to possess. "Cowards hide behind dead animals," Jake observed, his voice carrying easily across the space that separated them. "Sound familiar, Pete?" The reference to Pete's habit of using innocent victims as human shields during his crimes was not lost on the trapped outlaw, and he felt a flush of shame that was almost as painful as his physical wounds. But shame had never been enough to change Pete Carlson's nature, and it would not save him now. Pete's hand groped frantically in his vest pocket, searching for the small derringer he kept as a backup weapon for situations exactly like this one. The tiny two-shot pistol was hardly a match for Jake Morrison's Colt, but it might be enough to turn the tide if Pete could find the right opportunity to use it. That opportunity seemed to present itself when movement at the far end of Main Street caught Pete's attention. A small group of townspeople, apparently believing the shooting was over, had emerged from the general store and were approaching cautiously to survey the carnage. Among them, Pete recognized the young deputy sheriff who had tried to arrest him that morning, along with the German baker and several other local merchants. A desperate plan formed in Pete's fevered mind, born of the same cruel instincts that had made him infamous throughout the territory. If he could threaten the innocent townspeople, perhaps Jake Morrison's legendary sense of justice would force him to hold his fire long enough for Pete to escape or at least take a few victims down with him. Pete rose slowly from behind his horse's body, the derringer concealed in his left hand while his right remained visible and apparently empty. The townspeople froze when they saw him, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and revulsion that Pete had inspired in victims across half of Texas. "Hold it right there, Morrison," Pete called out, his voice regaining some of its old arrogance as he raised the derringer and pointed it toward the cluster of innocent bystanders. "You take one more step and I start shooting folks who ain't got nothing to do with our disagreement. How many dead shopkeepers you willing to have on your conscience?" But Pete Carlson had made the final mistake of his violent career by assuming that Jake Morrison's reflexes had slowed with age or that his legendary accuracy had dulled with years of retirement. The Phantom of San Antonio's draw was a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to follow, his Colt appearing in his hand as though summoned by magic rather than skill. The bullet from Jake's weapon passed through Pete's right wrist with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, shattering bones and severing tendons with an impact that sent the derringer spinning harmlessly through the air to land in the dust 20 feet away. Pete's scream of pain and frustration echoed off the surrounding buildings, and he collapsed to his knees, clutching his ruined hand against his chest. The fight went out of Pete Carlson in that moment, draining from his spirit like water from a broken barrel. He had spent years terrorizing others through superior firepower and ruthless cruelty, but faced with a man whose skills far exceeded his own, he discovered that he possessed none of the courage he had always demanded from his victims. "Please," Pete whimpered, his voice breaking as tears of pain and terror ran down his dust-stained cheeks. "Please don't kill me, Morrison. I'll do anything you want. I'll leave the territory, change my name, never hurt nobody again. Just don't shoot me like a dog in the street." Jake Morrison approached slowly, his Colt held ready, but no longer aimed directly at his defeated enemy. His gray eyes studied Pete's broken form with something that might have been pity, though it was too cold and distant to offer any real comfort. "You know what the funny thing is, Pete?" Jake said quietly. "Most of that gold you stole was already spent. Whiskey and cards and whores, just like always. You destroyed my peace and hurt my horse for maybe $3 in loose change, and the rest was just holes in your pocket." Pete's sobs grew louder as the truth of Jake's words sank home. He had thrown away his life and the lives of his men for a handful of coins that were already gone, sacrificed everything for the temporary satisfaction of humiliating an old man and hurting a defenseless animal. But Jake Morrison was already turning away, his business in Amarillo finished, and his appetite for violence satisfied for what he hoped would be the rest of his natural life. The Phantom of San Antonio had emerged from retirement one last time, and now it was time for him to return to the quiet obscurity he had sought for 15 years. Behind him, Pete Carlson knelt in the dust of Main Street, crying like the broken child he had always been beneath his mask of cruelty and violence, while the good people of Amarillo began the long process of cleaning up the mess that men like him always left in their wake. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street, as the people of Amarillo emerged from their hiding places like prairie dogs cautiously venturing from their burrows after a thunderstorm. The air still carried the sharp scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of spilled blood, but underneath those harsh notes lay something sweeter. The smell of justice served, and a community freed from the grip of fear that had held it captive for 2 long days. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb approached the scene with hesitant steps, his young face pale but determined as he surveyed the carnage that had transformed the quiet street into a battlefield. For bodies lay scattered across the saloon porch where Diamond Pete's gang had made their final stand, while Pete himself knelt in the dust beside his dead horse, clutching his shattered wrist and sobbing like a child awakened from a nightmare. Webb drew his service revolver with trembling hands, though he kept the barrel pointed safely toward the ground. He had seen enough violence for one day and had no desire to add to the body count, especially since the man responsible for ending Pete's reign of terror stood nearby, with his own weapon holstered and his hands hanging peacefully at his sides. "Mr. Morrison," Webb said, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of trying to sound authoritative while addressing a living legend, "I'm going to have to ask you to surrender your weapons while we sort this situation out. There's going to be questions about what happened here, and I need to follow proper procedure." Jake Morrison turned his pale gray eyes toward the young deputy, and Webb felt a moment of panic as he wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. But instead of the cold fury that had marked Jake's confrontation with Pete Carlson, the deputy saw only weary resignation and something that might have been approval. "You're doing your job, son," Jake said quietly, slowly drawing his twin Colts and placing them carefully on the ground at his feet. That's more than most folks in this town were willing to do when it mattered. You've got backbone, Deputy Webb. Don't let anyone tell you different. Webb felt a flush of pride at the unexpected praise, but he forced himself to remain focused on his duties as he moved to secure the weapons and check on the wounded outlaw. Pete Carlson looked up at the approaching deputy with eyes that reflected nothing but broken desperation and the dawning realization that his days of terrorizing innocent people were finally over. "Please," Pete whispered, his voice barely audible through his tears and the pain of his wounds. "Get me to a doctor. I'm bleeding something fierce, and I think my wrist is busted all to hell." Webb nodded curtly and gestured towards several townspeople who had gathered nearby. "We'll get you patched up, Carlson, but then you're going to jail to await trial for your crimes. And after what folks have seen today, I don't think you're going to find much sympathy from a jury of your peers." As Webb organized the removal of Pete and the bodies of his dead companions, Jake Morrison walked slowly toward the saloon porch where his stolen gold lay scattered across the bullet-riddled table. Most of the coins had spilled from the leather pouch during the gunfight, gleaming like fallen stars against the dark wood stained with Pete's blood. Jake gathered the gold pieces one by one, his weathered hands gentle as he returned each coin to Sarah's pouch with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. There was less than half of what Pete had originally stolen, the rest having been spent on whiskey and gambling and the other vices that had always consumed whatever money passed through the outlaw's fingers. Tommy Sullivan emerged from inside the saloon, his face showing the mixture of awe and nervousness that seemed to characterize everyone who found themselves in Jake Morrison's presence. The bartender carried a bottle of whiskey and a clean glass, which he set on an undamaged section of the bullet-riddled table. "On the house, Mr. Morrison," Tommy said quietly. "Least I can do after what you did for this town. We've been living in fear for days, and nobody else was willing to stand up to those animals." Jake accepted the drink with a nod of thanks, though he only sipped it sparingly. His fighting days might be over, but he had learned long ago that a man needed to keep his wits about him even in moments of apparent peace. Too many good men had died because they celebrated their victories before ensuring those victories were complete. Down the street, Dr. Henry Caldwell knelt beside Rosita in the shade of the livery stable, his skilled hands examining the angry red welt that Pete's quirt had left across the mare's flank. The elderly physician had tended both human and animal patients throughout his long career, and his face showed the same professional concern he would have displayed for any suffering creature. "She'll be fine, Mr. Morrison," Dr. Caldwell called out as Jake approached with his recovered gold. "The wound is painful but not deep, and there's no sign of infection setting in. A few days of rest and proper care should see her right as rain." Jake pulled several gold coins from Sarah's pouch and placed them in the doctor's palm, despite Caldwell's protests that no payment was necessary. "This is for her care and for any other folks who might need tending after today's troubles," Jake said firmly. "My wife always believed in paying our debts and helping our neighbors." Mayor Frederick Ashworth, a portly man with the soft hands and careful manner of someone who had spent his life avoiding violence rather than confronting it, approached Jake with obvious nervousness written across his doughy features. Behind him walked several of the town's leading citizens, all wearing expressions that mixed gratitude with the kind of desperate hope that came from people who had finally found someone capable of protecting them. "Mr. Morrison," Mayor Ashworth began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a politician trying to make the best possible impression. "On behalf of the citizens of Amarillo, I want to thank you for what you did here today. You've rid our community of a terrible menace, and we're all in your debt." Jake's response was a non-committal nod that neither accepted nor rejected the mayor's gratitude. He had learned long ago that politicians rarely offered thanks without expecting something in return, and he was not disappointed when Ashworth continued with his real purpose. "The thing is, Mr. Morrison, we've been without proper law enforcement for some time now. Our sheriff resigned last month rather than face Pete Carlson's gang, and Deputy Webb is a good young man but inexperienced in dealing with serious threats. We'd be honored if you'd consider taking the sheriff's position permanently." Jake's smile was thin and cold as a winter morning. "Mayor, I appreciate the offer, but my fighting days are behind me. What happened today was a personal matter, not the beginning of a new career. Young Webb, there has the makings of a fine lawman if you give him the proper support and training. Before Ashworth could voice his obvious disappointment, Jake turned toward Deputy Webb, who was overseeing the loading of Pete Carlson into Dr. Caldwell's wagon for transport to the jail and medical attention. The young man's handling of the aftermath had impressed Jake, showing the kind of calm competence that could be developed into real leadership with time and experience. Deputy Webb, Jake called out, and the young man hurried over with the eager expression of someone hoping to learn from a master. I've got something for you. Jake reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a gun belt remarkably similar to the one he wore, complete with a well-maintained Colt Peacemaker in a worn leather holster. The weapon was clearly a backup piece, kept in perfect condition but showing the signs of long storage rather than daily use. This belonged to a good friend of mine who died in the line of duty, Jake explained as he handed the gun belt to Webb's trembling hands. He would have wanted it to go to someone who'd use it to protect innocent folks rather than gathering dust in some collection. Webb accepted the weapon with something approaching reverence, his young face reflecting his understanding of the honor being bestowed upon him. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I swear I'll do my best to live up to your friend's memory and your example. Jake spent the next hour giving Webb a crash course in the practical aspects of frontier law enforcement, sharing lessons learned through decades of experience in dealing with dangerous men and impossible situations. He spoke of the importance of reading a potential opponent's body language, of positioning oneself to maximum advantage in any confrontation, and of the absolute necessity of being willing to use deadly force when the situation demanded it. Most importantly, Jake emphasized, never draw your weapon unless you're prepared to kill the man you're pointing it at. Hesitation in a gunfight is the same as suicide, and dead lawmen can't protect anybody. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, casting Amarillo in the golden light that seemed to soften even the harshest edges of frontier life, Jake Morrison prepared to leave the town he had inadvertently saved. His business was finished, Pete Carlson was in custody awaiting trial, and the community had been given the tools and confidence needed to protect itself in the future. Rosita seemed to understand that their brief stay in Amarillo was ending, and she stood quietly as Jake cinched the saddle around her healing flanks with extra care. The mare's injury was minor but still painful, and Jake had no intention of pushing her harder than necessary on their journey home to the quiet ranch where he hoped to spend his remaining years in peace. Tommy Sullivan approached as Jake prepared to mount up, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Trail provisions, Tommy explained. Salt pork, hardtack, and a few other necessities for the journey. It's the least we can do. Jake accepted the package with genuine gratitude, understanding that it represented more than just food for the trail. In the harsh economics of frontier life, such gifts were precious expressions of respect and thanks from people who often had little to spare. The last person to bid Jake farewell was Deputy Webb, who stood at attention with his hand resting on the grip of his newly acquired Colt. The young lawman's face showed a determination that had not been there that morning, tempered by a realistic understanding of the challenges that lay ahead. Mr. Morrison, Webb said formally, I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to keep this town safe and peaceful. And if any more men like Pete Carlson show up, they'll find things a lot different than they expect. Jake studied the young deputy for a moment, seeing something of his own younger self in Webb's earnest determination. I believe you will, son. Just remember that the goal is keeping the peace, not proving how fast you can draw. Sometimes the best gunfight is the one you manage to avoid altogether. 6 months later, Jake Morrison sat on the porch of his small ranch house, watching the sun set over the rolling hills of central Texas while Rosita grazed peacefully in the pasture nearby. The mare's injury had healed completely, leaving only a faint scar to remind them both of their brief return to the violent world Jake had hoped to leave behind forever. The ranch was modest by the standards of the cattle barons who dominated much of Texas, but it provided everything Jake needed for a quiet retirement. A small herd of horses, a vegetable garden tended with the same precision he had once applied to tracking outlaws, and most importantly, the gravesite where Sarah Morrison rested beneath a simple headstone carved with words of love that would endure long after the man who wrote them joined her in whatever came after this life. Jake visited Sarah's grave every evening, bringing fresh wildflowers when he could find them, and sharing the quiet observations of a man who had seen too much violence and found peace in simple things. Tonight, he told her about the letter he had received from Deputy Webb, now Sheriff Webb, reporting that Amarillo had enjoyed 6 months of unprecedented peace and prosperity. Pete Carlson had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, his days of terrorizing innocent people finally brought to an end. More importantly, Webb had proven himself capable of handling the smaller problems that inevitably arose in any frontier town, settling disputes through reason and the authority of his badge rather than gunplay. The most interesting news in Webb's letter concerned a group of would-be troublemakers who had ridden into Amarillo the previous week, clearly intent on testing the new sheriff's resolve and perhaps establishing their own reign of terror. But they had taken one look at the wanted poster Webb had displayed prominently outside his office, a poster featuring Jake Morrison's likeness and a detailed account of his legendary career, and decided that Amarillo might not be the easy target they had assumed. The troublemakers had ridden through town without causing so much as a disturbance, and Webb reported with obvious satisfaction that word was spreading throughout the territory that Amarillo was under the protection of the Phantom of San Antonio's personally trained successor. Jake smiled as he finished reading the letter, understanding that sometimes a reputation could accomplish what violence could not. The legend of Jake Morrison would continue to protect innocent people long after the man himself was gone, a legacy of fear among criminals and hope among those who needed protection. As the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars appeared overhead, Jake Morrison rose from his chair and walked slowly towards Sarah's grave, his weathered hands carrying the day's selection of wildflowers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and perhaps new threats, but tonight there was peace in this small corner of Texas, and sometimes that was enough for any man to ask of the world. The Phantom of San Antonio had returned to his rest, but his shadow would forever stand guard over those who needed protection from the predators who stalked the frontier. And in the growing darkness of the Texas night, that shadow seemed almost real enough to draw a gun and fight one last battle for justice.